Welcome back to Quick Movie. Today I will explain a drama thriller film from 2018 titled Hippopotamus. In the beginning of the film, we see an injured young lady gradually restoring her cognizance in what gives off an impression of being a completely white room. The second she wakes up, she frenzies and attempts to get up, yet can't do as such. It turns out her legs are injured, canvassed in gauzes. As the lady investigates her environmental factors, a vile male voice shows up, telling her she slept in. The man presents himself as Thomas Alcroft, her kidnapper. He clears up for the lady that he intends to keep her hostage until she falls in love with him and continues to tell the lady her name, Ruby Watts, alongside other individual subtleties from her life, similar to where she's from and where she's gone to college. He even educates her regarding her folks' callings and how he knows she's anxious about the dim. Ruby plainly has no memory of how she wound up in Thomas' consideration, nor does she recall her life preceding her capturing. Crying, she asks Thomas how has he treated her, suggesting the injuries kneeling down. Thomas tells her he cut off her tendons and trains all her from moving if she at any point has any desire to walk once more. He likewise illuminates her that he didn't contact her confidential effects, which are in a dark purse sat on a seat close to the entryway. On the floor close to Ruby we see what has all the earmarks of being a dinner in a little cup containing 2 pills. Thomas makes sense of that he gave her 2 pills, 1 preventative pill and 1 pain reliever. He then continues to make sense of for Ruby how their coexistence will seem to be. She will be offered day-to-day food. He'll help her wash and go to the restroom. Her days will begin at 7 a.m. What's more, end at 11 p.m. What's more, getting away from will be for all intents and purposes unthinkable since they're miles from the nearest family. When Thomas gets done, Ruby inquires as to whether he had attacked her, to which she answers he didn't. Thomas then, at that point, leaves, abandoning Ruby in the room. As the scene reaches a conclusion, we see Ruby got a brief look at her wristband, which bars the etching Ruby X. The following day, Ruby is currently at a similar spot as she was yesterday. The unfilled plate close to her uncovers she ate the dish Thomas had arranged for her, yet didn't contact the pills. Thomas goes into the space to look it up on her and lets a disheartened moan. When he sees Ruby denied taking the pills, he argues for her to take the drug, as her agony will just deteriorate. However, Ruby overlooks him. As he goes to leave the room, Ruby asks Thomas for what valid reason he's doing all of this, to which he doesn't answer. Thomas leaves the room and as the entryway forcefully closes, slicing the scene to dark, we hear Ruby's frantic cry from the opposite side. Afterward, that very day, Thomas visits Ruby once more. This time the room is concealed with a dim red light, flagging that it's evening. Thomas cautiously changes Ruby's resting body so she lays in a fetal situation on the floor and leaves the room. The following morning, Thomas presents to Ruby her morning meal. Ruby is as yet sound sleeping, however is stirred when Thomas thumps on the wall. When he leaves, Ruby's, languid in daze, look morphs into a serious one, uncovering that her lethargic state was an exterior. He'll help her wash and go to the restroom. Her days will begin at 7 a.m. Also, end at 11 p.m. Also, getting away from will be for all intents and purposes incomprehensible since they're miles from the nearest family. When Thomas gets done, Ruby inquires as to whether he had attacked her, to which she answers he didn't. Thomas then leaves, abandoning Ruby in the room. As the scene reaches a conclusion, we see Ruby got a brief look at her armband, which bars the etching Ruby X. The following day, Ruby is currently at a similar spot as she was yesterday. The vacant plate close to her uncovers she ate the dish Thomas had arranged for her, yet didn't contact the pills. Thomas goes into the space to look it up on her and lets a disheartened murmur. When he sees Ruby denied taking the pills, he argues for her to take the medicine, as her agony will just deteriorate. However, Ruby overlooks him. As he goes to leave the room, Ruby asks Thomas for what valid reason he's doing all of this, to which he doesn't answer. Thomas leaves the room and as the entryway closes, slicing the scene to dark, we hear Ruby's frantic cry from the opposite side. Afterward, that very day, Thomas visits Ruby once more. This time the room is concealed with a dull. Thomas cautiously changes Ruby's dozing body so she lays in a fetal situation on the floor and leaves the room. The following morning, Thomas presents to Ruby her morning meal. Ruby is as yet sound snoozing, however is stirred when Thomas thumps on the wall. When he leaves, Ruby's, lethargic in daze, look morphs into a serious one, uncovering that her tired state was an exterior. She then scoops her direction to her purse, which is on the opposite side of the room. She opens and rummages through it and takes out her mirror, which holds her ID. Ruby gazes at it, confused after she saw a shadow from a small window. She hastily returns her effects to her pack, yet a little plastic sack escapes and rolls away. Ruby hurries back to her typical spot and notification the ball. She reaches to get it and figures out how to conceal it in her pocket. Before Thomas goes into the room, Thomas brings her a plate of food and reviews her face. He sees she is in torment and says she ought to have told him. He goes after his pocket and takes out a pill bottle. He encourages Ruby to take a higher portion and she consents. He hand takes care of her the pills and leaves. Later we see what is by all accounts a lady drifting in dull water. It just so happens, it was a section of Ruby's fantasy. She awakens bothered and attempts to get up yet stops as a sharp torment goes through her legs. Thomas is as of now in the room, sitting in a seat near Ruby. Ruby asks him what his identity is and how has he treated her. Thomas serenely says exactly the same point he made to her whenever she first saw him in the room, that he is Thomas Allcroft and that he intends to keep her hostage until she falls head over heels for him. He rehashes a similar data he is familiar with her. Ruby asks how has he treated her legs. Thomas makes sense of it was a vital method to restrict her possibilities taking off and that her legs will get better over the long haul. He illuminates her that she should simply remain agreeable and take her prescription. He guarantees her that he has no secret malevolent aims. By giving her preventative pills, Ruby is helped to remember her regular timetable and how thin her possibilities are of getting away. She keeps quiet until Thomas goes to leave the room. Yet again she inquires as to whether he attacked her. Ruby asks him what his identity is and how has he treated her. Thomas smoothly says exactly the same point he made to her whenever she first saw him in the room, that he is Thomas Allcroft and that he intends to keep her hostage until she becomes hopelessly enamored with him. He rehashes a similar data he is familiar with her. Ruby asks how has he treated her legs. Thomas makes sense of it was a fundamental system to restrict her possibilities taking off and that her legs will get better over the long haul. He illuminates her that she should simply remain agreeable and take her medicine. He guarantees her that he has no secret malignant goals. By giving her prophylactic pills, Ruby is helped to remember her ordinary timetable and how thin her possibilities are of getting away. She remains quiet until Thomas goes to leave the room. She by and by inquires as to whether he attacked her. She goes to her sack and takes out a mirror, yet doesn't figure out how to see quite a bit of her physical issue. She winds up hammering the mirror into more modest pieces and takes her nearer to her injury. Before she could see anything, she sees Thomas keeping an eye on her from the opposite side of the entryway. She conceals the glass shard under the swathe of her passed-on knee and attempts to return to her sitting spot. Before she does, Thomas goes into the room and medications her. When it's evening, Thomas plays a sound that is planned to deter Ruby from moving and getting away. He continues to tidy up and adjust the room and winds up nodding off on the seat. His telephone alert awakens him. He switches the beating sound down off and sits Ruby in a vertical position and leaves. We then see a progression of days Thomas and Ruby spent together, which comprised of Thomas carrying Ruby food and assisting her with her cleanliness and Ruby going through the greater part of her evenings playing get with her ball. One morning, Ruby is seen caressing with the sink's pipes. The wreck she made doesn't seem to annoy Thomas when he enters to bring her morning meal. While he examines what she did, Ruby inquires as to whether she could pose him an inquiry. She asks him what might occur in the event that she doesn't fall head over heels for him, and will she stay hostage everlastingly in the event that she doesn't. She proceeds to kid about how Thomas treated her legs. Thomas asks her what could he at any point provide for her, which befuddles Ruby. Thomas says she's clearly feeling improved because of the reality she's in any event, kidding about her circumstance. Thomas expresses that she should set exhausted and offers to bring her something up to make her visit more okay. Ruby thinks briefly and requests that Thomas bring her a cushion and a sweeping and a book to relax. Thomas consents, then, at that point, gets some information about the two drawings on the wall, one of a seat and one of a cerebrum done in pencil. She says they're pretty. Thomas praises her by saying she is more appealing and requests that she rehash what she needed to be brought to her, and she does. The following day, Ruby is seen on a bedding with a pad close to her. Thomas enters and gives her a book. After she flips through it, she states she read it before Ruby gets overpowered, since that book is the main thing she recollects before her life in imprisonment. Thomas clarifies for Ruby that she could get back a portion of her recollections whether they're set off by specific triggers, which gives her a good omen. Thomas offers to assist her with recovering her memory and she says thanks to him. Afterward, when Thomas brings her food, he inquires as to whether there is anything she needs. She says she needs a red bramble tea and he in a flash carries it to her. Subsequent to smelling it, Ruby stirs a memory. She grins and questions Thomas whether he realized she planned to pick this particular tea. He grins and tells her that it's the main thing she drinks. Ruby asks him how can he know all the data about her, to which he answers he did all necessary investigation. Later in the day, Ruby is seen looking at her book. She staggers to a page loaded up with evidently useless letters. However, as she puts the mirror piece she hit before on the letters, she winds up seeing a portion of the letters illuminate have no faith in him in the mirror. Thomas cautiously goes into the room. Seconds after the fact with a table. It turns out Thomas believed that them should eat together, which they do. Thomas gets some information about the book and Ruby applauds it, particularly its closure. Thomas grins and endeavors to clasp Ruby's hand with his, however Ruby pulls away. Thomas asks Ruby what's up. Albeit reluctant from the start, Ruby asks Thomas the number of others were held hostage before her. Thomas denies her charges, however Ruby set on revealing reality. She continues to blame Thomas for following, oppressing, attacking, and killing young ladies like her. She can go on. Thomas hits his clenched hand against the table which surprises her. Yet again he wipes CL before ear the blood on his arm and denies her claims. Ruby cases she doesn't need Thomas having done this before to another person, as she accepts what they have is extraordinary. Thomas swears there is no other person and leaves the room. The subsequent Thomas leaves, Ruby's frightened articulations vanishes, uncovering to the crowd that she was simply imagining. The following day we see Thomas illuminating Ruby her legs are mending yet they need additional time. At the point when he leaves, Ruby opens up the swathes from her legs and examines her physical issue. Maybe no cuts were made on her legs. She figures out how to get up and goes to the entryway. At the point when she contacts the door handle, she opens another memory which is of a man and Ruby before her front entryway. Ruby abandons endeavoring to open the entryway and returns to her bed. As she is perusing the dark message in her book, she coincidentally spreads the ink the message was composing with. After she smells the ink that stained her hand, another memory is opened, this season of herself concealing something behind a block in the room. Ruby eliminates the block and 12 matches drop out, uncovering that the dark messages were composed utilizing the matches. Afterward, Thomas and Ruby are eating. Ruby requests a light to set up a heartfelt state of mind. When Thomas carries it to her and illuminates it utilizing a match, he continues to tell her that they ought to begin once again and Ruby concurs. Ruby then, at that point, enlightens Thomas concerning the common dream she's been having of her sinking profound submerged. As she tells the subtleties of her fantasy her hand inches nearer to the match. She tells Thomas her fantasies and when a hand contacts save her, toward the finish of her story, her hand is on the match, yet Thomas has his hand holding hers. Ruby fakes a hack and carries her hand to her chest, effectively taking the match without Thomas taking note. In the following scene, we find out how Ruby's days are turning out. She's writing in her book, practicing her legs and rehearsing how to utilize her messed up reflect part as a weapon. While Thomas is assisting her with strolling once more, she's imagining her legs aren't in extraordinary condition. Toward the finish of the scene, we notice Ruby composed cooperate in her book. The following morning Ruby is seen during push-ups. She races to her bed. When she hears Thomas moving toward her room. To stay away from doubt. She professes to peruse her book. Thomas proposes he ought to assist her with practicing her legs before supper, to which he concurs as Thomas assists Ruby with strolling. Yet again she goes about as though her legs are injured. After they figured out how to get to the opposite side off room, Thomas praises her on her advancement and states that, on the off chance that they proceed with along these lines, they might eat higher up at night. Once more, Thomas and Ruby are eating. Thomas declares that this is an exceptionally unique dinner and urges Ruby to taste it. After she takes a chomp, Ruby opens another memory, one being of her and Thomas eating at a cafe. They appear to be on a date and are alright with one another. Thomas then requests that Ruby shut her eyes and continues to put on a necklace he purchased for her. He kisses her on her brow. We then, at that point, slice back to the present. Ruby is in shock and asks Thomas whether they were together before Thomas hubs his head and tells Ruby that the dinner she strikingly recollects was their commemoration feast. Ruby mournfully grins at him around evening time. Ruby is seen cleaning her teeth as she respected the two drawings Thomas put on the walls. They seem to be on a date and are comfortable with each other. Thomas then asks Ruby to close her eyes and proceeds to put on a necklace he bought for her. He kisses her on her forehead. We then cut back to the present. Ruby is in shock and asks Thomas whether they were together before Thomas nods his head and tells Ruby that the meal she vividly remembers was their anniversary meal. Ruby tearfully smiles at him at night. Ruby is seen brushing her teeth as she admired the two drawings Thomas put on the walls. She notices RAW written on one of the corners of the drawing. In the morning, Ruby sees someone in a boat whilst looking through a small window from her room. Later, she and Thomas are discussing her book. Thomas mentioned how inseparable Ruby was from her book. He starts reminiscing off the memories together. As he tells his story, the scene cuts to Ruby drawing surrounded by numerous crayon drawings. Thomas is sound asleep on her bed when she made sure he was out cold. Ruby quietly makes her way to the door before she opens it. Thomas says it's cold outside but it's a coat. Instead of opening the door, she reaches down to pick up a ball as Thomas slowly awakens. The scene ends with Ruby saying she can't sleep. The next scene opens with Ruby sleeping in bed and Thomas covering her with a blanket, which triggers another memory of what seems to be her and Thomas being intimate. The next day Thomas dances with Ruby, which triggers another memory. The memory is of Ruby and Thomas dancing at a party while Thomas is proclaiming his love for her. Ruby tells him she feels the same way in that a kiss after experiencing the memory. Ruby tells Thomas he now fully believes they were together. Later Thomas explains how the remote control, which controls the whole room's electronics, works. He puts up some music and Ruby starts dancing for him. They laugh and kiss, but before they start to get intimate, Ruby starts crying. Ruby asks him, how did they get to this? And Thomas agrees to explain it to her. As Thomas is explaining the story, the scene cuts to the past. We see Ruby waiting for Thomas at a bar. She's with her roommate Nic, who's openly flirting with her. Thomas doesn't make it to meet her, and he missed the train. Thus Ruby and Nick leave to go home. Thomas leaves Ruby, sage that is being picked up by his friend Robin, how he'll hopefully see her soon. Meanwhile, Nick tries to kiss Ruby and she refuses, but he persists. He knocks her unconscious and brutally assaults her upon seeing the aftermath of what happened when he came to Ruby's house. Thomas killed the still drunk Nick and carried Ruby to Rob's car. Rob reluctantly drove them both to Thomas' home, where Ruby regained her consciousness. It is revealed Ruby lost her memory due to the incident with Nick, therefore Rob can call an ambulance. Thomas stops him. They argue for a bit, but Rob agrees to help Thomas out in his plan to regain Ruby's memory. They travel far north where Thomas breaks ties with Robin. Thanks to him for his help, Thomas proceeds to take Ruby to an abandoned island farm where he keeps Ruby prisoner. As time passes, Thomas starts learning about retrograde amnesia, a form of amnesia in which the sufferer forgets everything prior to an attack. He also learned that Ruby's memory seemed to reset to just as it was right after the attack whenever she would sleep a lot. Thomas proceeds to show Ruby pictures to trigger her memory recovery, but she is unresponsive at first in an attempt to speed up her memory recovery. Thomas learned how to trigger certain memories and control her sleep patterns so she could learn for more than a day when he gives her her favorite book. Ruby is responsive and shows progress. Thomas continues his efforts but decides he needs a blank slate in order to truly regain Ruby's trust and memory. So he constructed the White Room and made up the whole scenario about cutting the ligaments of Ruby's legs and being her kidnapper. When Thomas finishes his story, Ruby is left in tears and seems to get her memory back. To become intimate and fall asleep on one another, Ruby awakens first and turns off Thomas' watch before it can ring his alarm. She takes the broken mirror piece and stabs him. She starts crawling to escape, but Thomas tries to stop her. She kicks him with her feet and manages to escape to the outside. She gazes tearfully at the sky above, then runs to the boat, but passes out before she can make her escape. She awakens in a hospital room with a doctor, assuring her she'll be fine, and that she experienced some short-term memory loss due to her injury. The doctor is revealed